Okay, welcome to those who have joined for today's Quincy Institute panel. If you're not familiar with the Quincy Institute, it's a think tank based in Washington, D.C., that advocates for U.S. foreign policy that's more rooted in restraint and realism instead of military intervention abroad. And Today, we're going to be talking about one of the longest U.S. military interventions abroad, and that's the U.S. intervention in Afghanistan. And We're joined by Matthieu Aikins, who won the Pulitzer Prize just a couple weeks ago for his investigation into how U.S. support for warlords contributed to its own failure in Afghanistan. And if you're not familiar with Matt Aikins, he's a contributing writer for the New York Times Magazine and a fellow at Type Media Center. And since 2008, he's been covering conflicts in Afghanistan and the Middle East, spending significant time, years on the ground. His work has received the Polk and Livingston Awards, among others, in addition to this recent Pulitzer. Um, and his first book, The Naked Don't Fear the Water, is about an undercover journey to Europe with Afghan refugees, where he lived as an Afghan refugee. And of course, my name is Adam Weinstein, and I'm the Deputy Director of the Middle East program here. So, Matt, let's jump right into it. You won the Pulitzer Prize for your investigation into a particular warlord. And while you won it just a couple weeks ago, you've been following this particular individual since around 2009, I think. Is that correct?
Yeah, that's right. I received the prize along with two of my colleagues at the Times, Azam Ahmed and Christina Goldbaum, and they also worked on stories that were about the U.S. legacy of the war in Afghanistan. And Azam and I worked on an investigation of this key U.S. ally, this Afghan general, this warlord named Abdul Raziq. And what we uncovered was the largest campaign of forced disappearances during the war. We interviewed thousands of people in Kandahar, taking advantage of the kind of access that you can have now, that the fighting has stopped. So you can get into areas that were previously very difficult to go to. And we've assembled, more than 300 cases of people who've been disappeared by US-backed forces, by Abdul Raziq's men during the war. But as you mentioned, I had actually been following Razek's story for quite a long time. I first met him in 2009, shortly after I'd recently arrived in the country as a young freelancer. I basically hitchhiked my way there and from Europe, and I met some drug traffickers who picked me up on the side of the road and befriended them. And they introduced me to Razek, who was business associate of theirs. And at the time, he was just a local border police commander. This was 2009, but within a couple years, thanks to his backing with the U.S. By the U.S. military, he would become police chief of Kandahar province, which was a key province in southern Afghanistan and one of the most powerful men in the country. So our careers kind of paralleled each other in an odd sense, and I was following him all those years up until his assassination in 2018 when he was felled standing next to the top US general in the country.
Who among us hasn't hitchhiked with drug traffickers in southern Afghanistan? But anyway, at the time you're doing this, most of the reporting in Afghanistan is focused on the gear up to the surge and this idea that, coin or can still work and journalists embedding with U.S. Marines. I myself was served at the tail end of the surge as a U.S. Marine, a little bit in Kandahar. I mean, a little bit in Helmand, but mostly in Uruzgan. But Kandahar, of course, is the birthplace of the Taliban. What made you follow this story rather than going with the herd that was really seemed to be bought into U.S. coin strategy at that time?
Yeah, it's an interesting question that I often think about because, I would say that today the war is universally regarded as a failure, as a disaster, as something that was never really had a chance of succeeding even. the way that it ended, in the collapse of the Afghan government and this humiliating, disastrous withdrawal that caused so much suffering. I think there's no way for even its most, erstwhile ardent defenders to defend it anymore. So, but that was not the case in 2009 when I showed up in the country. It's easy to forget now, but at the time, there was a lot of enthusiasm for the war in Washington and in elite US circles, policymakers, but also journalists. And there was this sense that the war was not going well. The violence had increased, like all the metrics were bad, so to speak. But there was a plan to win it, right? The surge. You had Generals Petraeus and McChrystal and the best and the brightest who were rolling out these plans, and there's a lot of money involved. And so I think it's difficult sometimes for people to remember, and some people don't want to remember just how much enthusiasm there was around the war in those years, and how much it was a sort of consensus that there was a plan, that it was reasonable to surge, to trust the generals, to send in more troops and more money. Um, that skeptics of the entire war were kind of outsiders. I mean, you had people on the left, but also on the right. Thinking like Andrew Bacevich, for example, but they were marginalized, and so I think it was because of the way that I arrived on the scene. I came in, as a nobody. I graduated from college in Canada, and I didn't have any connections. I never lived in New York or worked for any American publications. I was just a scrappy freelancer, and instead of hanging out with generals, I was hanging out with drug traffickers in border towns. And so I saw a very different perspective of the war. And what I saw in the case of Raziq was that um, people were very afraid of him because he and his men were torturing and killing people, and that there was this brutality to the government we were backing that I didn't really see reflected in the official narrative. Certainly not to the extent that it mattered to people on the ground who are more afraid of him than the Taliban, which is kind of the whole point. And so I think it's just that first experience and the dissonance between what I was seeing on the ground and what people seem to be believing about the war in Washington and Kabul just marked me as an outsider and gave me a sense that there was a kind of massive act of self-delusion taking place on the part of the United States government, military, and its elites.
A reminder to those watching, you can submit questions in the Q&A, and if there's time, we'll try to bring them into the conversation. There was a bit a mass delusion, I think. I think that's a good way to put it. I mean, even shows like The Daily Show would challenge the basis of the Iraq War, but you rarely saw them challenge any of the doctrine or the accepted doctrine surrounding how we were executing the Afghanistan war. But I want to talk a little bit more about Razik for a moment and where he's from, Spain Bulldog, which is um, a tough place, and he grew up in a very tough way, in a brutal way. His father had been disappeared, uh, allegedly by a rival tribe, and then as a young man, he had taken a liking to guns and cars, and he was in business with his uncle, who I suppose was a bit of a second father figure to him, and then this was during the excesses after the anti-Soviet jihad when it was every warlord for himself, and they were setting up checkpoints and they were engaged in brutal acts of robbery, sexual assault, kidnapping, and so forth. And then the Taliban movement emerges as this sort of Robin Hood movement, and they capture his uncle and they hang him from the barrel of a tank. And then later on, his brother is also killed. So he is born into this very brutal life. And how much do you think that shapes his own brutality? And to what extent was he really a unique individual, or was he just kind of a product of that environment, and it was a place where these tribal feuds produced a great deal of brutality?
Well, I think that's all that's always the question when we look at history, which is kind of the work that we've been doing is very recent history. How much is it the result of an individual, an extraordinary individual, and how much is it the result of larger historical forces, structural forces? Would there have been another Raziq, if not for him, or did he single-handedly shape the destiny of Kandahar, and therefore did his assassination, represent this fatal blow to the Republic, certainly in the South? And I don't think it's either or. I mean, Raziq's, like as you pointed out, he came from a very hard scrabble um, time in Afghanistan, very brutal, unsentimental time that again, the conditions that were shaped, of that brutality, that violence were shaped by superpower competition. It was the United States and the Soviet Union that were pumping weapons and money into this area that fueled the border war, these smuggling gangs, that had long plied the border regions between Afghanistan and Pakistan, suddenly were backed by superpower patronage, and that just accelerated the level of violence and killing. So Razik was certainly, like the people of Kandahar in general, a victim of that. But he was also an agent and someone who just from very, very early age, I think, showed kind of bravery and a propensity to be a fighter. And he had the backing of his tribe, so he sort of came from a family that was important. Um, but a lot of it rested on his personal charisma. I think one of the reasons why Americans liked him so much is because he was charismatic. He was personally courageous. He, even though he was at the center of some very extreme corruption that I think was one of the main reasons why the mission failed in Afghanistan, he didn't seem like someone who was so motivated by, personal wealth. He was a pretty frugal guy. He didn't lavish himself with, luxury goods or decadence. He really cared about power and winning. And again, it was a brutal fight. Um, to switch more, I think, to the kind of structural level of explanation, one of the things that I've been trying to understand about Razik is just again, yeah, how much of a prisoner of a certain logic of the war he was, and how much both the Taliban and Razik were kind of shaped by each other's actions. So I guess to back up a little bit, I first came to this story from like what I would call a human rights perspective, that one that informs a lot of journalism, right? Where you see people are being tortured, killed. That's bad, right? Which of course it is. But I think as time went on, and I began to, also evolve in my thinking, I wanted to understand a little bit more about why this was happening. It's like, of course, Razik is doing all these terrible things. We all knew it, and we can talk a little bit more later about who knew what when, but there was a reason this was happening. Like Razik, again, he wasn't someone who seemed to be personally that cruel. He's ruthless, but I never heard of him like torturing people personally, which some other Afghan warlords in the area, they did. They seemed to like it. Razik, I never heard of that. He was doing these things because they worked. And why did they work? What is it about this kind of violence that makes it so common in civil wars and insurgencies? And it turns out, if we look at the scholarship on civil war, on insurgency, on irregular warfare, where you have um, a contest that's not over territory, it's not armies clashing on the battlefields. It's a struggle for control of populations that happens in guerrilla warfare and irregular warfare, which is what was happening in Afghanistan. And um, that is something that the U.S. Counterinsurgency doctrine recognizes as a battle for populations, but they had a very different view of it from that is I think, common in the scholarship. And there's a particular author that I cite in my story, Stathis Kalavas, a Greek political scientist who wrote this very important book called The Logic of Violence in Civil War. And what he argues is that these kinds of conflicts, because they're over populations and not territory, and in many ways they're struggles for information that is held by civilians, where the Taliban go, where is the patrol going to come, who put the bomb where, there is a very fundamental logic that incentivizes violence against civilians. And it incentivizes extrajudicial executions, torture, imprisonment, beatings, collective punishment. All of these things are done for military advantage. And it's a competition between two sides, where the use of tactics by one side that are advantageous will incentivize the other side. If the other guy's doing it and you don't, well, you're going to lose. And again, this just explains, not justifies, but explains why, if we look at Vietnam, Algeria, Sri Lanka, the American Civil War, where it was irregular in Missouri in the West, over and over and over again in these conflicts, we see the same kinds of violence against civilians. This is the violence that Raziq was engaged in. And so regardless of his personal qualities or biography, I think there is something inevitable about this kind of violence. And let's not forget the Taliban, of course, did it too.
Yeah, in your writing, you talk about how this idea of coin, or the idea that, we could prosecute a counterinsurgency without being violent, or without in a sort of humane kind of way, is itself a form of American exceptionalism. I mean, what I would note is that I think largely there were exceptions, but largely U.S. troops did, you know, did follow restrictions and rules of engagement and so forth. But the most brutal violence was just outsourced to the warlords, and that's how that worked. But I can't help but wonder, and this is an uncomfortable question. I mean, I think there's an assumption by most people um, that, okay, well, because we supported people like Razik, that's why we lost hearts and minds, and that's why we lost the war. But could it not be equally true that one of the problems with the Afghan government is there simply weren't enough Raziks? There weren't enough people who were really committed to the cause. I mean, it's very easy to criticize Razik, and he, I think, undoubtedly could be characterized, or it should be characterized, as a war criminal, but he was also a patriot in a sense that he was very much committed to defeating the Taliban. Now, some of that might have been about, his own power, but he was ruthless and he was committed, and that wasn't the case across the board.
Yeah, no, I think that's a very very provocative and interesting question. You know, the idea that brutality always backfires um, is a really comforting one if you think about it. It's sort of like the debate about torture, right? If torture doesn't work, if torture produces, unreliable information, then there's no debate really, right? We just don't torture. It's a bad idea. It's not going to help you. But if torture is useful, then it becomes a true moral dilemma, right? Stop the ticking time bomb. Same thing with human rights abuses in this kind of war, right? If they automatically produce a backlash and are just a bad idea, then there's no debate. But if they're actually useful, then we have a problem. And the I think the US coin theory, and just to explain that briefly, coin theory, counterinsurgency theory, became this huge buzzword during the surge, as this was the new military science that was going to allow us to solve first Iraq and Afghanistan by winning the hearts and the minds of the people, right? And so it was this idea that you have to get people's support because people are the battlefield for the insurgency. And in that respect, they agree with scholars of civil war and insurgency like Kalivas, right? Population is the battlefield. But in the American version, it was only carrots, right? You're only going to like win them over, win their hearts and minds. This is something that really it goes well with a democratic kind of liberal ethics, right? That it's about consent. But the fact is, war is not about consent. It's about violence. And on the battlefield, sticks are often much more effective than carrots, you know. And the Taliban knew that. They very effectively used violence against civilians to gain control over them. And that's again the case that you see in all these other wars. So, I don't think I personally don't believe that there is good evidence that brutality always backfires or that brutality backfired in Afghanistan. Because if that was the case, then why did the Taliban win when they were brutal, right? So, so yes, I actually don't. I think the way that the U.S. sowed the seeds of its own defeat is more complicated than just they backed abusive militias or abusive warlords. I think to your point, someone like Raziq was very effective. He brought security to Kandahar in his area, even as he simultaneously oversaw, one of the most brutal campaigns of the entire war. Certainly the largest campaign of disappearances. People were just plucked from their homes, taken to the desert and shot and buried on an industrial scale. We documented hundreds, but surely thousands of cases. And all this happened under the nose of the US military. And at the same time, he brought stability and peace to Kandahar and security, and actually became popular among a lot of the people on the government side for that, right? They would rather live in this kind of brutal dictatorship where they don't have to worry about their kids being blown up by a suicide bomber on the way to school. A lot of people made that choice. So if that's the case, then why did we lose? And I think it's a really complicated question and an interesting one that I'm trying to study with this kind of work. But I think what it really boils down to, Adam, is kind of something we mentioned at the beginning, which is self-delusion, um, and the way that that fostered corruption. So the republic collapsed, right? Why did the republic collapse like a rotten structure, right? Just before the last US troop was out, the whole thing came down. And clearly, this was a crisis of corruption and confidence and internal division. And I really see one of the drivers of that corruption, internal division, being a kind of hypocrisy around the war and the way it was being fought that handed it over to criminals. So, again, going back to brutality, the Taliban used brutality in a very sincere and honest way. They weren't liberals. They didn't believe in human rights. They believed in Islam and Islamic rights. And for them, waging the jihad was the most important thing. And if you were an infidel, if you're supporting like, the infidels who are occupying the country, you were a traitor. You deserved to be killed. So they would openly do that. They would go and they would take some, government worker and they would hold a very quick Sharia trial and say, okay, we're going to kill this person and execute the civilian and then usually return the body because that was important in Islam. They would return the body to the family. They didn't disappear people in the desert. Um, they kidnapped people for ransom, but those ransoms were often negotiated by the central leadership in Quetta. So all of this was basically taking place in a way that unified the movement and was consistent. And and that is completely different from what happened with Razik because Razik had to do what he did in secret to kill and torture people he thought were Taliban. It was all done, you know, covertly. It was done by criminals. By criminalizing this kind of brutality, we handed over the war to criminals. And of course, those criminals are not just going to kill Taliban. They're also, using their power to abduct their personal rivals, to abduct businessmen, to extort them. They are, using bribes and threats to intimidate honest prosecutors who want to stop them from doing human rights abuses. You know what I mean? And so it just contributed to this culture of corruption and internal divisions that meant that when someone like Razik was able to keep that together in his fiefdom, even though he had big clashes with the central government, but when he died, it all fell apart. His commanders turned against each other and his system splintered in Kandahar. So I think that's one cause. I mean, corruption is also driven by just the insane amounts of money we poured into that country, um, but I do think that the question of brutality is as causing a backlash is more complicated. Of course, in some cases, people will resist you if you're brutal, right? There's a cost to it, but clearly, if the Taliban were able to conquer Afghanistan like they did and maintain power now, um, despite being so brutal, brutality it's not a straightforward equation that if you lose the hearts and minds through brutality, you lose the war.
Yeah. And of course, both sides were using brutality in different ways, and the carrots that did exist weren't distributed equally. Um, if you were in a provincial capital, if you were in Kabul, you might see more benefits of the U.S. intervention than perhaps if you were in Kajaki. Um, so I think that might also be a factor. Um,
True, though a lot of the money went to Kajaki. I mean, a lot of the money I think a lot of the money was siphoned off in Kabul, but also huge amounts were just poured into these very unstable rural areas, right? Like Kajaki, there were U.S. military units there that were just pumping stabilization funds, funding militias, and that actually had a big effect. I think it did part of the success of the surge, because the surge was successful in the short term in stabilizing large parts of the South. Um, but I think that was just because they were buying people off. They would just go into an area and pay all the armed, all the men in the area, a salary to like dig ditches or be their militia. And that worked for as long as you're paying it. But then when you withdrew that money and the foreign troops, then that's like, again also something that contributed to the collapse. This kind of very short term focused effects.
hmm. Do you think the U.S. sometimes has, well, I guess I'm saying what I think, and you can feel free to agree or disagree, but sometimes I wonder if the US doesn't have too much trouble dealing with shades of gray in these situations, in which I think US policymakers and even the US public place a premium on what a government says almost more than it does. I mean, in the case of the Taliban now, it would almost be better if they it would almost be better for them if they said, well, of course women can go to school, and then like failed to implement any of it, and on the ground actually kept them all out of school, than to just, openly say, well, girls aren't going to go to school. And it seemed like parts of the Republic understood that. And so they'd say all the right things. I mean, if you listen to interviews of Raziq, he was saying all the right things, but then in reality, he wasn't operating that way. And it seemed like both U.S. soldiers, I mean, officers and the U.S. government was willing to kind of turn a blind eye and look the other way as long as you said the right stuff.
Yeah, I think that's correct. I think there has to be a certain level of plausible deniability. Uh, I think there's certain unspeakable things, that happened in the war, and it's not just it also helps to create that reality. I would say of like the perception is the reality in war, and because in the case of Razi, because the people in power were saying that he wasn't doing these things, or that it wasn't that bad or big of a deal, or they were investigating and they couldn't find evidence, because they just repeated over and over again untruths, then it it just sort of never really like became the kind of, I mean, it never became the kind of truth that the U.S. military and the um, politicians in Washington had to answer for. Like, again, I wrote about Razik for the first time in 2009. I wrote another story about him in 2011 after he became police chief that was about this torturing, kidnapping, murdering, um, photos, documents, investigation, testimony from victims. And it's like, well, it's not until 2025 that we're actually, the New York Times is publishing this. So I didn't work for the New York Times then. And it's like all we knew all this was happening during the war years. People on the ground did at least. But there was this kind of barrier to the truth actually becoming something that would change what was going on. There's all these, and I think that's yeah, saying the right thing and kind of maintaining a poker face is a key element in how certain truths are kept at bay when they are threaten the interests of power, of fighting the war. And Brozik was absolutely essential to fighting the war. So that being said, he wasn't completely hypocritical. He actually did say a few times, we're not going to take prisoners. Um, Also, if you look at, and I think these things might be changing too. I mean, if you look at today, the way that previously, I think unspeakable statements about war crimes have become are no longer taboo. I'm thinking particularly about President Trump talking about the ethnic cleansing of Gaza, or Secretary of Defense and the president supporting pardons for service members accused of war crimes. Um, I think that it's no longer nearly as taboo today to talk about violating the laws of war, the Geneva Conventions, committing brutality for a good cause, because that's how war is, and we have to fight that way. Um, and I think the war on terror actually has played a big role in that, in loosening the boundaries of what Americans consider to be atrocities.
Yeah, well, there were popular films like Zero Dark 30 that in some sort of strange way romanticized torture, or at least made you feel empathetic to the torturers and made you think that, well, it was part of this greater good in catching bin Laden. And so I think that does play a role. There's a comment in the chat that Afghans didn't choose the Taliban, that they just had no real option, and ultimately they were abandoned from the US. And I think that's a common belief among Afghans. And I think there was a prisoner's dilemma, so to speak, which gets to another comment in the chat, which why did the Afghan army fall apart so quickly, which was that um, I think the common understanding is that, well, there was this prisoner's dilemma and people weren't ready to die for a republic that was rotten at the top and not delivering for them. And they weren't going to die as Ashraf Ghani and his inner circle were fleeing the country. So even if there could have been this existential fight to defend the republic, and even though there's many more Afghans than there are Taliban, many non-Taliban Afghans, ultimately people chose to succumb to the Taliban because why fight when you were just going to be abandoned anyway? How much do you think that's true, and how much do you think it is owed to the Taliban's own cohesion or any other cause?
Sure. I mean, we have to remember this was a civil war. It was a war between Afghans. So there's not one group of Afghans, or one monolithic block of Afghans who could choose this or that. Some Afghans supported the Taliban. Some Afghans supported Ashraf Ghani. Some Afghans, I think most people in civil wars don't really support either side, and don't really, what they mostly want is to first of all be safe, and then, have be able to support themselves and their family. And so I think that we have to be careful about saying like the Afghans wanted this or that. People felt really disenfranchised. Yeah, of course, the Taliban are not running elections, or soliciting a lot of public feedback. But there was also, just plummeting turnout in the elections for the Afghan Republic, right? So people, I think, felt alienated from the political system. Um, the reason why the army collapsed like it did, I think, is it's about corruption, and the loss of U.S. support. I think the United States created a military that was sort of, you know, in its own image, and was therefore dependent on a lot of technologies and logistical programs that they were never able to actually, implement in a kind of sustainable way. Um, so there was a heavy dependence even after a lot of the combat troops came out on Western contractors. Um, there was a deep morale crisis. I mean, I remember just going to the front lines with Afghan troops, in 2015, and seeing that the food they would get was like a plastic bag with like a half rotten boiled potato in it. Like that's what was being delivered to them on the front lines. Um, and these were like, these were Afghan special forces. They were like, very sincere, hard fighters. And they would just tell me all these stories about the corruption in the officer ranks, how everyone above a certain grade had to buy their position, um, how there was just rampant nepotism. Um, and that was in 2015. So I think that corruption just got worse and worse. And yeah, indeed, there was no effective leadership. There was no trust between elites. I think up until the last minute, they were much more focused on their own internal infighting and positioning, um, and than they were on the threat from the Taliban. So they were disunited to the very end. And I think there was also a sense that they believed their own lies. Like, I think both the US and the Afghan government had kind of fallen victim to its own propaganda about the Taliban, how Taliban were weak, they were puppets of Pakistan, they were terrorists who no Afghans actually supported. Um, and they just, on some deep level, didn't understand the existential threat that they faced. So that I think it's maybe overdetermined when we look at it, why the collapse happened.
I think we're again in a bit of an echo chamber where you have, for the last several, since 2021, you have people saying over and over again, well, because it's not an inclusive government, it's going to collapse, or because there's tensions between the Haqqani network and, the folks around the Emir and Kandahar, it's going to collapse, or there's infighting, or there's going to be this mass resistance. And yet we haven't really seen those things develop. And I'm not saying that they won't, but often in the US, we just proclaim things because we think they should be true and they turn out not to be true. But I want to turn to a question in the chat, which I'll answer the first part and then turn it over to you, Matt. So somebody asks, what role did U.S. ignorance of Afghanistan, its history and culture and social dynamics play? And they also, in the failures at least, and they also mentioned green on blue attacks, which were the insider attacks of the Afghan army against the U.S. military personnel, and whether that had to do with our lack of understanding of culture. I'll answer that last part first and then turn it to you. Since I did work with Afghan soldiers, I think the U.S. military has a way of training that works on 18-year-old Americans quite well, which is that they break you down and build you up, and there's a bit of humiliation and things that go into that, and that's what basic training and boot camp and so forth is, and I think that works decently well in American culture, but it didn't work very well in Afghan culture, and so there was this kind of frustration, I think, that would U.S. Marines and soldiers were frustrated with their poorly trained Afghan colleagues and would treat them as you might treat an inexperienced young Marine, and that was seen as a personal affront, which sometimes led to these kinds of insider attacks. Other insider attacks were just good old fashioned Taliban infiltration and would have happened no matter what. I actually tend to think that this idea that if only we had understood the culture better and the history better, we could have succeeded. I find that exaggerated. I think if we had truly understood the history and the culture, we wouldn't have pursued the mission to begin with. And I often look at the Pakistanis who are fighting the Pakistani Taliban in Khyber Pakhtunkhwa and the tribal areas, and they have plenty of Pashto speakers in their military. They have plenty of deep on the ground understanding of Waziristan and places like that, and yet they're still having quite some trouble with that insurgency and TTP terrorists causing havoc in Pakistan. So, you know, I personally am highly suspect of this idea that if only we had had a bunch of Pashto speakers and understood the history better, we would have managed things. I think personally speaking, I think the more you learn about Afghanistan, the more you realize how fraught this mission was to begin with. But I'm curious what you think, Matt, and feel free to tell me I'm wrong.
No, I agree with pretty much everything you said, and it's an interesting contrast with Pakistan because both Pakistan and the United States, in many ways, inherited colonial era, ideas about counterinsurgency and tribal governance. A lot of those books that were written by British, imperialist officers in the Northwest frontier were part of the manuals that were understood by, part of the curriculum for U.S. military officers who were going over. Um, and in Pakistan, of course, they directly inherited the British system of colonial governance of the frontier territories. Uh, I would say that, like, and of course, that was a system of imperial control that worked fairly effectively, and did require deep, part knowledge on the part of British officers who go over there and spend their entire careers, learning Pashto and running around, in the tribal areas. But that was not a realistic model for, the United States in the 21st century doing 2-year rotations um, to Afghanistan, 1-year rotations rather, or 6 months in the case of special forces. And I think the problem is the coin, at its maximalist stage, right, was like, we're going to totally transform Afghan society, governance. It's going to be military, but it's also going to be political and cultural and economic, right? We're going to have a whole of government surge. We're going to have a government in a box. Like, there was this whole vision of basically, it was like a high modernist vision of radically remaking Afghan society in this liberal democratic mold, right? That was how we were going to win the war. And so I think that version, that maximalist vision, is something that was dependent on a very high degree of, yes, local knowledge, historical knowledge, language abilities, right? Um, and that was the problem. I mean, you could have imagined a much more limited military engagement in Afghanistan, and much more limited ambitions that wouldn't have been dependent on the kind of knowledge that might have been, certainly been more realistic. But coin, as one of the many problems with coin as a maximalist theory, was just that, yeah, it required a level of understanding. And the last thing I'll say, and I think this kind of gets to the green on blue issue as well, which is that, like, it's not Afghanistan is not like a static object. You can't just like know all about it and then you're able to understand things correctly. Like, Afghans get a vote too, and there was just this whole layer of Afghans who were interpreting the conflict and interacting with Americans and implementing policy on the ground, um, who had their own, agenda, had their own local concerns that were sometimes better or worse, but they were different in many cases. And so the reality was constantly changing. Every interaction, every new program, everything that you did had multiple second order and third order effects that kind of no one understood. Not, for example, I wrote a story about the trucking business in Kandahar in the South, right? The United States, when it went into Afghanistan, it was very different from Iraq, right? Iraq, we had a huge invasion, right? Hundreds of thousands of troops massed in Kuwait. They went across the border. They established their own logistical lines. Afghanistan was the opposite. You had small teams of, special forces and CIA go in, partner with local warlords, right? From the very beginning, they were relying on locals to supply them logistically, and they were bringing in these trucks mostly from Central Asia and Pakistan, right? From ports in Karachi. And this whole like system just grew around this to, like, eventually, when you had, the surge and you had hundreds of thousands of troops in Afghanistan, they're all being supplied by these local contractors. There was huge amounts of money that were being paid to the Taliban by the US. I mean, this was well documented eventually. But it's just an example of these kind of like second and third order effects that grow out of this massive scale of intervention that no amount of like reading history books is going to prepare you for, because they're emergent phenomena.
That's a good point. And it also seems like the Afghans that Americans chose to listen to were the ones that, Americans were most comfortable with. I mean, going back to Razik, he was a tough guy, but he wore a uniform, he was clean shaven. I mean, it's almost like he had been brought up to be able to have a good rapport with the Green Berets and Marines and soldiers who he might encounter, and they respected him. And why wouldn't they respect him? He was an enthusiastic, competent soldier, despite the fact that he was a torturer. And you look at Ashraf Ghani and the rapport. I mean, in DC prior to the collapse, it was extremely taboo to criticize Ashraf Ghani. Extremely taboo.
Mm.
Everybody, people liked having coffee with him. He was an intellectual. He liked discussing ideas. He was a soft-spoken guy. Why wouldn't the folks of DC like him? And then you look at the way they would talk about Karzai, and it's almost like their criticism of Karzai, not that I think Karzai doesn't deserve criticism, but the typical Washington criticism of Karzai was, I mean, he criticized the fact there was a drone strike, or he had the audacity to say we shouldn't kill Afghan civilians. I mean, what do you expect an Afghan leader to say and still have legitimacy? The fact
Hmm.
that you know we put you in this position, you're a nobody, and you have the audacity to challenge us. And I think that was the attitude.
Hmm.
And so we listened to the Afghans who we most saw ourselves reflected in, and
Hmm.
not necessarily a good way to decide who's going to be successful in a society so different from ours.
Yeah, no, I think it's a good point. I mean, but we should remember that Karzai also had his moment, his honeymoon period. I mean, when Tom Ford called him the best dressed, head of state on the planet, there was a moment of kind of Karzai enthusiasm in DC, and people thought he was great until, the honeymoon period was over and real differences in the relationship surfaced. Um, it's funny, sometimes I think that Karzai and Ashraf Ghani were actually they should have been in each other's place. If you had Ghani, someone like Ghani in the early years, a technocrat, when there was actually, a lot of the work was trying to correctly implement these development programs and set up the new government. That might have been a good time for him. And Karzai, he was a he was a peacemaker at heart, and he was someone who was like good at making deals and perhaps he would have been the one who could have successfully led, the Afghan government into some kind of power sharing arrangement with the Taliban. Um, their tragedy was that they came, in the wrong order, maybe. But the interesting thing about Razik is Razik was illiterate and didn't speak English. He did intuitively understand Americans, I think. He, for example, understood how much we value like medal ceremonies and gratitude. He'd always show up at like the medal ceremonies for the American soldiers when they would get some decoration on base. Razik would be there saying like, I appreciate your bravery, thank you. And the American officers really remembered that and they appreciated it. I think it was hard for a lot of these Americans to go over and risk their lives and feel like the Afghans didn't really want them to be there or appreciate this. And so someone like Razik clearly did. I think that was very meaningful. But he was illiterate. He was not media savvy. Um, and yet, by the time of his death, when he'd begun to rise to a national profile, had become very wealthy. He had started to attract some of these people in Kabul into his orbit. I mean, that was an interesting change to see that Razik, he become more and more respectable. Partially because of reports that I and others, human rights groups, the UN did about what was happening in Kandahar. For a while, Razik was sort of it was controversial, and a lot of the Kabul technocrat, Afghan liberal crowd maybe kept him at arm's length, or had real concerns of their own about him. But as the war got worse and as Razik became, wealthier, you saw it started to change. He would come to Kabul and he would have, gatherings, and there'd be all these young kind of liberal Afghans who would go to them and I would say how, impressed they were with him. So that was changing.
Okay, well, we have about 10 minutes left, and I'm going to ask you at least two questions. And I'll start with a softball questions, and I'll end with a tougher question. So I'm going to take a moderator's privilege and potentially ask a dumb question, but I think it might be interesting, which is that you've really been able to travel across Afghanistan during the war, after the war. You've been able to go places most people aren't able to easily go. And I think that, a big reason is just that you can travel undetected for the simple reason that if you don't speak, at least, you can kind of blend into Afghanistan. Um, is that true? And I've heard you say that in past interviews, and I think it's obvious. has that ever led to a weird situation or a funny situation or something you didn't expect or somebody having a negative reaction when they found out, in fact, you're not Afghan?
Well, I'd say that's the premise of my book. I wrote a whole book about a journey I made with an Afghan friend of mine who wanted to escape his country in 2016. And this is when all the boats were crossing to Europe. So I went with him, but the only way I could do that without getting kidnapped or arrested was to pass as an Afghan myself. And even though I'm not Afghan, I look Afghan and I learned the language, learned Dari fluently in the years that I was there. So we did that whole journey. And if you want, you can read the book, and there are lots of weird and awkward situations that happened. Generally, I find Afghans they're very confident about their own culture, and when you try to learn the language or imitate them in any way, they take that as a form of flattery and appreciate it. So I've always had positive reactions from Afghan friends when I learn how to act according to Afghan culture and speak the language.
Uh, I do have another question, but there's an interesting question in the chat. If maybe you can give a brief answer to this. What do you think about the Taliban's communication warfare versus the Afghan government and US's? I mean, do you think they were more effective at it? Do you think that played a role?
I think that the Taliban did have, yeah, they were very effective communicators. For instance, around the time of the collapse in 2021, they announced this policy of afwa, of forgiveness, right, of amnesty. And so there was all these videos they started posting of like government bases surrendering, where like the Taliban would be like, these guys would be coming out with their hands up, and the Taliban would be there being like, don't worry, taking their weapons, you're our brother, go in peace. And these videos were they were like, but they were authentic. Like they were, that's what was actually happening on the ground in these little bases. And it was just like some, local Taliban with his, crappy cell phone filming it. And so there was a kind of authenticity that drives virality, in social media. And these videos were everywhere. And I think that was a really powerful propaganda strategy that helped push for, troops to surrender. Um, I think the Afghan government got too wrapped up in its own communication strategy. I think Facebook, a lot of these elites, these ministers, they became so isolated in the end, like they couldn't leave their compounds because they were worried about being assassinated. So their whole world was kind of Facebook and social media, and that I think that became the sort of, but they were also manipulating it through propaganda. I mean, they had whole like troll farms, and they were called Facebook Chalawunki was the local term for these like troll farms and social media, many cases being funded by, United States PSYOPs programs. Um, and they were manipulating the social media, but that was also their reality because they were so isolated. And again, I think this is what I'm talking about in terms of believing their own propaganda and self-delusions.
So, it's less and less common to have panels about Afghanistan these days. And, SIGAR is winding down to an end. The Afghanistan War Commission is working away on a report. But as someone, noticed in or observed in the chat, the Afghan papers that were published by the Washington Post didn't receive nearly as much fanfare as uh, the revelations about Vietnam had in the past, the Pentagon Papers. Um, Afghanistan's out of sight and out of mind, and yet one of the reasons I decided to have you on, besides the fact you won a Pulitzer, was because I can't help but think we haven't really internalized the lessons of Afghanistan or even the lessons of partnerships with folks like Raziq. I mean, you talk about this collective delusion. Do you see any of these patterns playing out in terms of how we're interacting with countries in the Middle East, this wholesale support for what Israel is doing in Gaza, or anything else that the U.S. is doing these days, or Europe for that matter. I mean, do you think these lessons have been learned, or have they just been swept aside or applied exclusively to Afghanistan, and the bigger lesson sort of escapes us?
It's a good question. I think that, whether or not the elites or the military or or the media have learned the lessons. I think the American people have learned the lesson. When you see the level of skepticism that exists right now for interventionist foreign policy, and the way that ultimately it was Donald Trump and his movement that tapped into that tapped into this backlash against the wars, right? And if you look at the Secretary of Defense, Pete Hegseth, he says openly that like the generals lied to us about the wars and they were failures, and so ironically, it's the right that has capitalized off the failure of the 9/11 of the war on terror. Um, but I do think it's really essential to learn the lessons of the war. That's one reason why it was, I think, very meaningful to win the Pulitzer for what is kind of a retrospective on the war, because we make these same mistakes again and again in conflicts. Every time there is a war and powerful interest involved in that war, there's going to be a distorting effect around the truth, like we saw with Raziq. And I think even though the U.S. may be in a phase where it's less likely to intervene overseas, what we are seeing today is a very concerning mobilization of the tactics and rhetoric of the war on terror against immigrants and dissidents in our own country. So, the use of the language of terrorists, and in order to justify extraordinary measures and suspending civil liberties. So I think we only have to look at what's happening today to realize that we forget what happened during the war, especially the crimes that were committed against Afghans and Iraqis in our names and by our allies. We forget those things at our own peril.
Yeah, it's actually striking to me, as we still are unable to close Guantanamo and we accept our own kind of twisted legal logic for why that can't happen. We're outsourcing, you know, torture to El Salvador now, and using Guantanamo-esque logic for it. So it seems like some lessons have not been learned. With that, I'm going to thank you for your insights today. I recommend that everyone read your book. Anyone interested in ethnography or Afghanistan or refugees in general, it's a very well written book, and of course, to read your reporting on Raziq. This panel doesn't do justice to the prose you write with, and if you have the New York Times as a subscriber, you can just listen to it as an audio recording. I think one of your articles was 1 hour long. I listened to it as an audio recording, but I encourage everyone to check those out. We have a couple panels coming up. One is going to be on May 20th at 12 p.m. and it's Wither Trump's Iran deal. So in other words, tomorrow at 12 p.m. And it's going to be with Vali Nasser, Mohsen Malani, Ali Garanmaya, and Trita Parsi. So I don't think you could find four better people to talk about the prospects of a new Iran deal. And then on the day after, so Wednesday, we have a book talk about the future of the U.S. Dollar. And it's a discussion of Paul Bluestein's new book with Karthik Sankaran of Quincy. So I encourage you guys to tune into those. And I want to thank you, Matt, again for joining us.
My pleasure. Thanks for having me.